Good afternoon and welcome to The Way Forward. This is the speaker series from Quinnipiac University President Judy Olian. We're having thoughtful conversations about today's social, economic, and health challenges given the COVID pandemic and talking about ideas that will drive solutions for tomorrow. Joining us today for our panel discussion are two very distinguished journalists. We have Matt Murray, who is editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswire. He is responsible for all global news gathering and editorial operations. Matt has previously served as executive editor of the paper, and before that was deputy editor-in-chief. He joined Dow Jones in 1994 as a reporter in the Pittsburgh Bureau. Also joining us is Peter Spiegel, who is U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times. He oversees all editorial operations in the United States and the Americas from its regional headquarters in New York. Peter assumed that position in April 2019 after spending 3 years as a news editor in London, where he oversaw the daily FT news operations both in print and online. Peter and Matt, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
We also have joining us Daryl Richard, who's the Vice President of Marketing and Communications. And Daryl and I will be asking questions to Matt and Peter about how they've been managing their newsrooms during the pandemic. And we'll also be opening it up for questions. So if you've got questions for either Peter or Matt or for both of them, please don't hesitate to post those in chat. We have somebody who will be funneling those questions to us. So Matt and Peter, let's just get started. I'm interested in hearing from both of you about how your jobs have changed in the last 4 months and how you've kept an actual printed newspaper going without actually seeing the people that you're working with physically.
Peter?
Well, it hasn't been easy. You're right to flag up the physical newspaper bit of this. I mean, we have, along with Matt and the Journal, moved very aggressively to prioritize our digital offering, and that's the growth area. That's the place we see financially and economically the future of the industry. But we still have a, for lack of a better word, legacy print product that we need to maintain. And I always say it's a single point of failure. If you don't get the print product out, there's something missing on people's doorsteps next day. So we were very nervous about this. We actually, for the first few weeks, had a very skeleton crew going into the office to produce the newspaper, and then we decided one day to cut the cord, did it all remotely, and we held our breath, and it's gone well. Now, part of the thing we have had to do is move up deadlines a bit, make sure that we're sometimes the late breaking stories will not make it into the paper, but we've also seen a concomitant, decline in circulation in print. We've seen, I think, having know people at the Journal, having worked there myself, I think both of us have gone through a huge spike in online subscription, online traffic. So we've seen a growth in our online traffic, but the print has come down for various reasons. One, we, for instance, circulate a lot on airplanes, Lufthansa, BA, but even just the logistics of getting newspaper to newsstands because of lockdowns, we've seen the print circulation go down. So it's accelerated our push into the digital and towards, frankly, making the print edition almost not an afterthought, because we need it to be a quality product, but a less important product. But thus far, holding our breath, we have had not a huge amount of hiccups. We've been able to do it all virtually. We do things like this. We have sort of constant calls on Google Hangout where members of the newspaper team gather and sort stories, and they'll jump into the New York call or jump into the European call to figure out what the stuff they can take for the web and put in the print edition. But that's what we were most nervous at. And knock on wood, thus far we haven't missed an edition.
Mm-hmm. In our case, I'd say a couple things. So we have really, in the last few years, restructured to be so digitally oriented that, in a certain sense, getting print ready was a discrete task. We have a print desk that essentially has the lines of communication with their counterparts in the newsroom, and they become quite adept at putting the paper together downstream without too much connection to the rest of the process. So the challenge of getting that team to work remotely was real, but they do it, and it's actually been pretty seamless to move them over. I think there's been other good news in that sense, despite the difficult conditions of being away. So we've done other things that we've innovated quickly on. So the journal already had moved to sending a PDF to all subscribers of the paper that comes just after midnight. We had an e-reader product that wasn't very good. We moved to upgrade that e-reader product in a few weeks so we could offer it to people who were getting their print paper interrupted. So we've actually innovated pretty quickly on the fly. I mean, I think the biggest challenge in a general sense for us is news gathering, just the sheer process of connecting the reporter, the editor, the visual person, and doing reporting and getting outside the confines that this technology puts on you. And I'd say for the first couple months, we came out of the gate, you know, everybody, it was of the moment, emotions were high. It's gotten tougher as time has gone by. That being said, the fact that we're forced to connect this way is building some bonds and connectivity that I think will actually do us well in the future.
Now, you talked a little bit about the news gathering process. So I think about journalists, they're both in an interesting yet precarious position when it comes to news gathering in a COVID era, right? So they need to be on the front lines. They need to be amidst all of it and interacting with people to really get the stories. But at the same time, I'm sure there's a lot of concern for their own personal safety. So how you and Peter have been both having conversations with your staffs about that balance? And have you been detecting a lot of anxiety around how reporters do that balance in terms of when they can actually get out into the field to gather what they need?
In our case, there's definitely anxiety and people definitely feel it, but we just had a simple rule. Nobody should go into any situation to do any reporting that makes them personally uncomfortable. Their personal safety and feeling of security is paramount. So I don't want any editor talking a reporter into taking on something they don't want to do. Secondarily, you know, in the last 5 years or so across the journal, we've instilled a much deeper, fuller security training, medical training, so that when we send you in the field, you've got to be trained and ready to go and be in contact with us. Now, admittedly, we never really thought in setting that up that it would be as extensively needed in the United States of America as it might be in the Middle East or other places, but we've been doing training with people as they've gone out and put them in the field in careful circumstances. So I think that the anxiety that you describe is real, but it's worked pretty well for us, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty similar for us. I would say the one thing that helps is the wrong word, but certainly both Matt's news organization and mine, look, we're financial news organizations, right? That is our bread and butter. That's our core of what we do, business, corporate, finance. And most of those people have not gotten back to the office either. So if we suddenly said, go out in the field and report, there's no one actually to have lunch with or to meet with anymore because they're all in the same environment. So I think there has been, as Matt said, we've had similar anxieties. We have a similar rule that no one who doesn't want to go out shouldn't go out. I think the George Floyd protest sort of put us in a difficult position because, again, we were very nervous about not only police clearly targeting journalists in several of these, but also the prospect of spreading the COVID. So again, we picked some of our more senior correspondents to go out, made sure that, as Matt said, that they had the proper training and were guided in that direction. But by and large, most of our news gathering now for a financial news organization is covering people who are not in their offices. So it actually has not been quite as much of a concern as I anticipated.
Well, I'll tell you a good one. We had, I think this is fair versus the FT. We would do more general news reporting on and about in the United States. The journalist thing is interesting because certain views people have come out. So we had a journalist, I won't say where, but we had a journalist out reporting on lockdowns in the Midwest a couple months ago. And an aide to the governor in that state who knew our journalist was doing that started calling all the local businesses and officials saying, don't talk to this person, and harassing the journalist through the locals, trying to sick the police on the journalist because they didn't want the journalist there. And so, you know, we fired off a pretty sharp letter to the governor who apologized for it. But interesting stuff like that you wouldn't have thought about happening, you know, in Midwestern states not that long ago has happened.
Yeah.
Just a reminder for those who are listening, if you've got a question for Daryl or Peter, please post it in the chat function that you see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those as soon as possible. Matt, before we started, you and I were talking about how you miss being in the newsroom. Do you feel like anything is lost in the ability to interact with your reporters and editors in the newsroom and brainstorm that way?
Totally. Me with them and really them with each other. I mean, look, I feel I'm romantic about this topic. I'm not romantic about too many things, but I went into the news. One of the reasons I became a journalist, I think a lot of people go to newsrooms, is because there's an excitement, a frisson in the air in a good newsroom. You're producing a product in real time all the time. It used to be daily, which was exciting enough, but now it's all the time. You're around a lot of creative and smart people connecting on different things. There's both an individual element and a collaborative element to it. You're in the middle of talking about current events and current affairs, and you can bump into different people at different times and places. And the rules of behavior and conduct in the newsroom are a little looser than they tend to be in your standard corporate setting. So that's when you start out in your career, that's a plus. And so that kind of energy and excitement and the kind of interaction that comes just between people in the hallway or just running into somebody and talking about stories, I miss that enormously. I love my wife and my daughter, but I do miss leaving the house and spending time with my colleagues that way for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it is just, I mean, it really, Matt, even just talking about it, makes me nostalgic. I mean, look, we are a self-selecting group. We are journalists by definition are extroverts, and as a result, we like to be in settings where we're interacting with people. It's part of the reason we got into business. I think there also is how do you put it? It doesn't degrade coverage, but things that would happen elsewhere in terms of, connecting dots doesn't happen as easily. And again, I think it's very important, particularly when you have a market meltdown that accompanied the coronavirus coverage. We have various teams. We have our economic team, we have our markets team, we have our financial services team. And in general, in the New York office, they sit together. And so something that's happening in the markets, they can go talk to the banking correspondent saying, I think this is going to have an impact on your bank. The economics guys can say, well, actually, this is why it's happening economically. So you begin to be able to pull together the broader narrative of what's happening, what's happening in the markets may or may not reflect what's happening in the real economy. Those conversations are much harder to have when you're not just sitting next to each other and having that conversation with the editor popping in and that kind of stuff. The other thing we have found, and as Matt said, we're a bit smaller, obviously, here in the U.S. than we are, but we are really spread out internationally. So you had, spikes in the virus in, Germany, and you had spikes in Italy, and then we had spikes in New York. And what we found was, okay, we got a correspondent in our health correspondent in New York is going to do a piece on ventilators, and she's getting ready to file. Oh, wait a second. We have a Germany ventilator story. Oh, we got an Italy ventilator story. The ability to sort of even coordinate from a managing perspective has been much more of a challenge because, again, you're not in the newsroom. There's not an overhearing of the foreign editor talking to the New York bureau and the Berlin bureau. So some of that stuff has been problematic as well. But again, just to echo Matt, the thing I think we miss the most is just the fun of being a reporter, is being in that newsroom and interacting with really smart, fun, interesting colleagues.
Actually, so we received one of our first questions from a panelist, and so one of our own student journalists actually here at Quinnipiac was wondering from the both of you, so how has the pandemic affected the way your staff has been able to report on Black Lives Matter protests, police violence, and more importantly, your ability to have conversations in the newsroom about the action, about those diversity topics, and about how those stories take shape?
Yeah, I mean, it's been difficult. I mean, no doubt about it. I mean, again, from the point of view, both logistically, but also from a morale and kind of way, both been very, very difficult. Logistically, as I said, we were very nervous about the two things where very early on, it became apparent to us that police in some of these cities were targeting journalists. And that really got us very, very nervous about security of our staff. And then the issue of spread. We wanted to make sure that no journalist who was assigned to covering these protests were in any way worried about catching it. And we were afraid that even some of the journalists who wanted to go out there were going to expose themselves. So that was the logistics thing was incredibly difficult. But it was a very emotional event for the newsroom. I mean, we have, people who have experienced some of this stuff and trying to pick up the vibe in the newsroom and look, we, like almost every other major news organization in the Western Hemisphere, are frankly bad at diversity in the newsroom. We've been trying to get better. We haven't been successful, and so there was a lot of emotion tied to that, and trying to try to cover the story objectively and deal with some very fraught and emotions in the newsroom it would have been easier if we were in the newsroom, and instead we had to do sort of these town hall calls, on Zoom and on Google Hangout. They're impersonal. It's hard to put your arm around a colleague if you're not in the same room. So, look, it's not tough. I'm not sure any of it got it right, but it's been a challenge that we've had to work through.
Yeah, I agree with all those thoughts. I think that for some colleagues, the pain that they're feeling in the moment, the frustration they're feeling, it's hard to acknowledge when you're doing it remotely, and it's accentuated by being remote. They're indoors, they're quarantined, they're frustrated, they're isolated. They're in touch with each other virtually, but just the whole process of communicating, talking, sharing thoughts, getting input has been much tougher, and helping think through ideas and helping people try to help people feel better is just much more difficult. So it's been a challenge. I mean, in terms of reporting, I think when you've got protests, when you've got action on the streets, the concerns Peter raised are real. And we had a reporter who was knocked over by a police officer in New York City, and was a bit of an incident. For instance, there's challenges there. I will say, I think it's such an important and great story. Journalists want to be out there covering it, and so getting people to go cover it, they feel that feels like a really meaningful thing for them to be doing. So there's a little aspect of that there too.
Right.
We've got another question from the audience, and this is kind of tied to what we were just talking about in terms of tensions being high right now. How do you guard against bias in your coverage?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a complicated question, and it's not necessarily a question that is different in nature now than at any normal time. I think what's maybe harder now, or harder in the moment a little bit, are maybe two things. One, communicating to the whole staff, this is how we do things, this is why we do them, this is what we think is important. It's just more of a challenge in this moment. Communication on every front is harder. Remoteness, including feeling remote from the leadership, is tougher. And secondly, and I think every journalist is wrestling with this in a very serious and profound way, in a very thoughtful way. When you're dealing with the death of George Floyd and the feelings it stirs about race in this country and the history of racism in this country, and the difficulty, it is it is one of the hardest kinds of stories as a journalist to try to separate your emotions and your strong feelings about truth from the journalistic responsibility, and to know where that line lies. And people of great intentions and serious, sober thought about it sometimes would draw those lines in different places. So you also have a moment amid the current challenges of communication where, we all say we want to have conversations, we all say we want to talk about these things, but having those conversations is harder remotely, and having people be honest in sharing thoughts is harder remotely. So it's difficult. I mean, but I think fundamentally, I think this is probably true of the FT too, we are having debates about the lines and discussions, and I know some journalists feel differently about these things than I do, and some of their editors do, but I think the quality of the conversation that we're having about it is pretty high, and the sincerity and good intentions of everybody is pretty high, and frankly, we've moved as editors too. Race in America is not a story the Wall Street Journal had covered consistently and thoughtfully for over long periods of time. We've done some great work at moments of time, but we hadn't thought it through as deeply as we should have, and we're doing that now, and that's important, and that's partly from journalists pushing us too. So it's a challenge for people. It's a challenge to let people know in a moment when everything is divided and everything feels that it's so high stakes, that what we do as journalists and how we do it and the way that we do it really does matter. It's really its own social contribution too. That can feel frustrating as an explanation for people, but I also really believe it to be true. So trying to reemphasize that again and again, we're bearing witness, we're writing the stories, we're speaking to large groups of people. If we stay as fair as we can be and show that we don't have a bias, actually our ability to influence the conversation and get people to hear unpleasant things is greater because they trust us. And that's really important. But the people having that, we have to remind people of that message for sure, because it's a very, very emotional, difficult time for a lot of people. Sorry, Peter.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. And I just, the slogan of media bias always sort of scratches me slightly, because I just think it's a cheap way of describing what happens in the news gathering process. Look, news judgment is not a science, right? It is the collective wisdom of a fallible group of human beings who run any news organization. And one person, you see all this anger on Twitter that this is bias and stuff like that. Those same debates happen in editorial conference every day. And, I think to say that media is biased is unfair, in that we are a human organization that has to make judgments every day. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we get it very wrong. So I think, there was the thing that always would slightly bother me also about the issue of bias is, I remember it was Len Downey who would not vote because he wanted to make sure that he was unbiased. And I think we all come to the table with our own experiences, with our own biases. And the thing is to acknowledge them and then try to put them away. And I think to Matt's point is, if you feel very strongly about these issues, you have an incredibly powerful tool to deal with them, and it's called journalism. Go out and report on these things. Go out and give these people voices you think they haven't had voices. And I would, again, even more so, as Matt pointed out, the FT, particularly in the U.S., is not a general interest news organization to the extent that the Journal is. So we haven't covered a lot of these issues, but it's hit us very much. I've argued internally, much like the Brexit vote did. And bear with me, because it's not a perfect parallel, but we woke up and I was in London, as Chris said. I was the news editor. I was running the day-to-day operations of the news organization. And boy, did we miss this, right? I mean, we are nominally a London-based news organization. There was a whole swath of middle England, working class England, that voted for Brexit, and we kept saying it's never going to happen. What we did is we decided that we needed to cover this bit of England better. And we assigned it a foreign correspondent, an American, and just said, your job is to go out and find this community we clearly have underreported on, mostly white working class in Middle England, in Newcastle, and some of in Wales, and some of these cities that have been bypassed by globalization, and said, your job is to report on these things that we clearly have missed. And I think we have looked at this moment as something very similar. This is a story we have missed. We have missed a whole bit of the population that has been bypassed, that has not had, if you look at employment figures, you look at the things we cover as our core, economic coverage, they have been bypassed by what has happened in the U.S. over the last 20, 30 years. We need to then focus on that, because it's a story we missed. And we're signing a reporter to do that. We're hiring a reporter to do that, sort of the political economy of race in America. And that's pretty much something that we think now is core to what we do in terms of covering economics, covering finance, covering business. And it's I think, as news organizations, sometimes we just have to put our hands up and say, hey, we missed this story. Let's get it right the next time.
Yeah, this issue of bias, we'll expand it a little too. And we started talking a little bit around politics, but that's another area where I think folks see more and more, there's a call out for more fact checking, not just fact checking that would be a standard part of the journalistic integrity process, but publicly having to post fact checking examples, some journalists or some outlets on a regular basis to sort of illustrate the point counterpoint what they've done. But also I'm wondering if, has it exacerbated that need because of the lack of access to a lot of sources, particularly in a COVID era? I'll say a COVID era where you can't access those sources in person, but also at the digital era. So more and more sources, whether it be individuals or organizations, are sort of using their own digital platforms as the place to issue their communications and not sort of allow access to reporters. Peter, I think one of your own reporters was chiming in our chat here with a Q&A, explaining that, he has found that himself with some of his sources he would typically go to, who now it's all, we'll issue our statement online, sort of we'll issue our communication online, and that's that. You don't have that chance for the count point or the rebuttal of a certain type of line of questioning. So has that exacerbated a little bit of this feeling of bias in news media, or the access to the facts?
I guess so, but frankly, I think it's a two-way street. I mean, one of the things that has kept governments, and governments plural worldwide, honest, is the fact that health organizations are putting out the data on, new cases, new death, new fatality rates. I mean, one of our most successful piece of online content in the history of the Financial Times was one of our digital journalists back in London decided he was going to track on a daily basis how the countries compared themselves, and it became sort of what we got known for at the FT in our coverage. Again, it's millions and millions of page views, the most successful thing we've ever done. So the fact of the matter is that some of the innovations in digital journalism plays perfectly well into the current environment, and frankly, if it hadn't been for some of our digital journalists who are tracking these things, I think a lot of governments would be we've had governments that have misled their people on these issues. So in that respect, I think it's been actually in some ways helpful. Now the issue of just read our Twitter account, we'll put out a statement. I think that is certainly complicating things. I think it complicates us, frankly, but from both a news gathering point of view, but obviously a commercial point of view. It's no secret 9 out of 10 every ad dollars online goes to Facebook and Amazon, not to Matt and I or news organizations. But to be honest with you, it is in some ways always thus. There were always going to be companies and governments and financial institutions that were going to try to bring journalists in and explain to them what they were doing and why they were doing it. And there were some that were just not going to talk to you, and you had to work around to find other points of entry to tell those stories. So I'm not sure that is that different. The hard thing is you can't just sort of say, let's go grab lunch. You meet someone at a conference, you have a chat. Some of the ways that you cultivated sources in the past and developed human relationships just don't exist now. And you can't just say, hey, I want to just set up a casual Zoom call with you to chat for about nothing for a half hour.
Right.
So those processes in which you source develop, you develop relationships with people in banks, in private equity firms, in governments. If you don't have pre-existing relationships, it's very hard to suddenly develop them in this kind of environment.
You want me to answer too, Daryl? Or
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
look, this is a tangential thought. I think that the online world has for a while anyway, and raised the stakes for individual journalists that much more on your prior question about showing that you're fair and unbiased, because you're living in a world and companies are just people putting out their own press releases are just one of many, many voices. But the work you produce will be so much more transparent, so much more picked apart. Your Twitter account as a journalist exposes you to accusations of bias every day, and the digital world is filled with trolls of all political stripes who actively want to hurt journalists and journalism. So, it's all of a piece to me in the digital context. And that's why, one, the world needs fair and straight reporting without a political agenda more than it maybe did at different times. And two, why as a journalist, you're more on the spot to prove every day that you can do that, because you do have to prove it every day. The gatekeeper assumption that an institution per se is fair because of the institutional power and access it has, that's gone. On the other hand, the authority you can win as a fair institution is still there to be won, and you just have to be out there every day. So it's changed that for journalists quite a bit.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. We've got another question from one of our student journalists here at Quinnipiac. Can you elaborate on how you think COVID and this time will affect the future of international bureaus and global reporting?
I can start on that, I guess. Look, we were already in a crisis, I would say, on international reporting heading into this because of the financial condition of most U.S. media organizations. They've already pared so far back on international reporting. And even more broadly, I think we tend to be right now in a moment in the United States where we're particularly inward looking. And so we're very focused on our own internal place. And so I think international news was already in a severe crisis coming into this. I don't know that this particularly changes the game, with the possible exception of the fact that because this is such an international incident, maybe it'll help news organizations think about the connectivity of the United States to other places, to think about organizations like the WHO. But I think at this point in the United States, there's a handful of big organizations who are committed to international reporting. It would be us, the FT, Reuters, the AP, the New York Times. I think barring financial pressures on the industry, I don't see any of those who are doing it really pulling back, I guess is how I see it.
I think, for good or for, well, I would say for good. I mean, it's been slightly different for us because we do see we're not a domestic news organization in any market that we're in. I always like to.
We are a foreign bureau. This is a foreign bureau.
Well, exactly. I always like to say we're the only major news organization in the world, and I think that's true, that has more readers outside its home market than inside its home market. We have about a third in the UK, a third in the US, and a third in continental Europe. And then sort of a smattering in Asia. So everyone, there's a huge percentage of our staff that are foreign bureaus. And in many ways, my pitch to American readers is, come to the FT, we give you the world. So we have had less pressure on us than perhaps some domestic U.S. press on bureaus. So we have made sure that we've ring fenced a lot of our investment in the foreign network. The problem we've had is slightly different, which is there are countries, and the U.S. may be one of them, that have handled the coronavirus crisis so badly that reporters who would normally be really enthusiastic, particularly going into the developing world, now are a little bit reticent to go. We've had this particular issue with some of from our India bureaus, where we've had people who have been really enthusiastic about getting out to Delhi or Mumbai, who've said, gosh, the way they're handling this, I'm not so sure I want to take my family up there anymore. Some of our bureaus in sub-Saharan Africa, same concerns. So the problem that we've had has been more internal logistics on personnel and making sure they're safe and making sure they're comfortable in their bureaus, in places that the healthcare systems are not quite as developed, and that kind of thing. So it's been less of a financial issue than more of a personnel logistics issue for us.
The biggest thing happening in the moment, I would say, on all foreign bureaus is the U.S.-China relationship. And so the one of the tragedies, and COVID has been part of it, but only a part of it, is coverage of China, already a challenge, which we've been committed to for a long time as the VFT, is going to be chilled, and just at a time when understanding China is as important as it's ever been, maybe more important than it's ever been. That's going to be difficult. Some organizations where they've had a foreign correspondent or two in recent years have tended to be in China. So that's the big story happening right now on foreign reporting from an American perspective.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, we're getting slightly off on a tangent, but obviously the Hong Kong security law has also impacted a lot of us as well. I mean, we have our Asia headquarters in Hong Kong. Some of these measures are clearly aimed at foreign media. The New York Times recently announced they're moving most of their digital news operations out of Hong Kong to Seoul. We are, as many people know, owned by a Japanese news organization now, Nikkei, which is sort of the FT Wall Street Journal of Japan. So we have, infrastructure we can fall back on in Tokyo, but it's suddenly become a very, very difficult story. Even it wasn't for COVID, because of the pressures that the Chinese government have put on mostly American, but certainly Western in general news organizations operating inside China, and particularly now in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so and I think it would be accurate to say a lot of news organizations pre-COVID were under a lot of financial pressure. There's a lot of consolidation. Do you see that accelerating specifically because of COVID? We're seeing it in many industries as a result, of course, but news organizations in particular, do you think more and more will consolidate, merge, some just go out of business?
Yeah.
Sort of a related question to that, will that potentially then risk fewer and fewer diversity of outlets for readers to go to consume information that informs different perspectives versus seeking out editorial coverage that just sort of validates their own opinion beforehand?
I would say yes and yes. I mean, we're seeing it. The digital. It's been a disastrous year for digital media. Vox just had more cuts this week, and the model that seems so hopeful 5 years ago it was already troubled heading into it, and it's worse. Depending on, we have a total advertising recession if you're advertising supported. There is a readership subscription model, but you have to have attained a certain mass to do that, which requires a fair amount of skills and specialty and technology, and it's a difficult model to build from scratch. Local news continues to wither on the vine, and almost every week there's stories of local papers falling apart. I think what you touched on at the end is important, which is people will go where the money is, and that often right now means partisan sites of both parties and opinion sites and other things that are remaking the news ecosystem in front of us. So yeah, I think the trends that were underway have been radically accelerated in the last few months.
I mean, being one of the few senior Americans at a British news organization, I always try to be the optimist. I will try to be optimistic here. It's been very, very difficult. I mean, again, you know, I was one of the great enthusiasts for places, as Matt said, Vox and BuzzFeed. I mean, you know, the hope I always had was this is going to shake up. There's money to be made in journalism. We just got to figure out the model. And it was really heartening to see places like BuzzFeed in particular, which I've spent a lot of time looking at, morph from a slightly kooky, listicle kind of place to doing proper journalism. And not just here in the US, they opened up operations in the UK and did some great stuff on Russian espionage in the UK. And then the entire thing was shut down. So that's been somewhat depressing. The only thing I will say is, you know, I think sometimes we forget that 100 years ago, you know, William Randolph Hearst, yellow journalism. There was a period where there was multiple newspapers that bloomed up and then died and were partisan and were you know, they were yellow, and that's why they're called yellow journalism. And I sometimes my hope is that we are going through that kind of environment right now, where it's hyperpartisan, it's splintered, you know, everyone's mad, it's really passionate, but eventually out of that morass will come a new model that we can identify as proper journalism. And again, just to Matt's point also about the business model, I think sometimes people forget, you know, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Times, these news organizations have been actually tremendously successful in getting people to pay for their online content. I mean, we're up, gosh, 40%, I think, in the last 2-3 years. And, you know, the Journal's had a bump.
You guys, the Journal, the Times, the Washington Post, we all probably have the most subscribers that we've ever had in our history right now, right?
And that, to me, says there is a market out there for quality journalism. And, you know, it heartens me to see that, you know, as horrible as the coronavirus crisis has been, our numbers are almost double what they were at the peak of the Brexit crisis, which was our previous all-time high. And people are willing to show up and pay. And in some ways, the fake news, or whatever you want to call it, the propaganda trends in media has helped us. People are saying, I need a trusted brand. I want to pay for it because I need to know facts. And that's what the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal provide. So I like to be optimistic. There are days where it's very difficult to be, but I will try to be the optimist.
I mean, I think for the biggest organizations, those numbers are a reason for optimism. I think they're part of the reshaping of the landscape. But I'll make one more point. Often when we talk about these on panels and conferences, we also talk very much through the legacy print lens. And, you know, television news is where most Americans get their news, their local television news station. And I think they've been hit by advertising and some other pressures, but the local television news ecosystem, I think, is you know, reasonably robust, particularly compared to the print ecosystem. So for better or worse, your local TV channels where most Americans have gotten their news for a long time.
Could both of you talk a little bit about election coverage coming up and how you're thinking about that, given that maybe the candidates won't be going out and having things around the country? How do you plan on covering an election, given the fact that the candidates may be remote?
Matt, why don't you deal with that? You have a bigger operation here doing that kind of stuff.
I mean, the reality is, even if they're not out and about, it's in some ways that's a plus. We have reporters assigned to each candidate, and they can write about their policy positions, and they follow them. And the president's out there a fair bit right now, and the vice president's getting out more too. I mean, so I think actually it's a little bit logistically challenging in the way that you suggest, Chris, but at the same time, it might also allow us to get to matters of substance and policy more than some of the theater of campaigns sometimes. I think that's possibly to the benefit of the readers if we can do more about their policy differences, write more about their plans and programs, their taxes, and where they disagree, rather than you know, this rally or that parade or whatever. So I think I think it could be, I actually think broadly it could be fine for us, in the sense that a fair amount of political coverage in a normal year is theater and show, and in those years you're stressed with how do I get substance versus this? Do I go have to cover this speech? It might actually be, in that sense, journalistically a little better. That's kind of my view at this point.
I mean, not to talk too much on this, but it's been a little bit tougher for us, I think, in that, all right, I've got this job out a year ago with the mandate of growing the U.S. audience for the Financial Times and trying to come up with a case for, all right, I'm an American, why would I read the FT over the Journal or the New York Times, which has more resources and a more regular political coverage? Why would they come to the FT? And we had a plan in place. We had set up some projects we were going to hit over the course of the next few months. And then this happened. We had to scrap the whole thing. So it's been a bit of a challenge for us and trying to recalibrate, what is the FT's, where do we bring value added to an American audience in particular? Now, the heartening thing is even our sort of, our stories we're doing now have just, again, done gangbusters business. We just launched a couple of weeks ago our poll tracker. Now everyone kind of does this now, which is, you look at the poll of polls, and we have this interactive thing where you can say, you think they're going to Arizona? Yes, no. Here's what the electoral college looks like. It's, again, next to our coronavirus tracker. It's the most consumed piece of journalism content we have online right now, and vastly over indexes for the American readers. So we're doing something right. People want it. People like it. But we're trying to have to recalibrate on the fly in this one because we're not quite as well resourced as some of our U.S. rivals on this, and trying to figure out what we bring to the table as a nominally foreign news organization that is trying to compete directly with Matt and our friends at the New York Times and the Washington Post. It's tough. It's tough having to change mid-course.
I know you want to ask one more question. I want to let you do it, but I'll just add my bias, though. To be fair, my bias. It's one of the reasons I like business journalism, is political campaigns, and particularly presidential politics, are over-covered relative to the importance of all kinds of other forces that shape our lives. And it is filled, very often, we have great political reporters and I respect them, so I don't mean any disrespect when I say this, but very often the political reporter is left during a campaign day after day after day, finding something to write about today when nothing really happened. That is part of the boys in the bus. So if the moment allows us with our resources to focus on the substance a little bit and avoid some of that, I think that's a net plus, personally.
Yeah. Chris, do you want to get the final question in? I know we can make sure we get Matt to his very important lunch date with his daughter. So
make it a zinger, Chris.
Yeah.
I think you're on mute, Chris.
Chris, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I shifted screens to get the question. Just focusing on the future, as we think about innovations in media, what do you think will be the biggest change in how you'll report news 5 years from now?
Boy, it's hard to think about next week, never mind 5 years from now. Look, I mean, we've all had these discussions about what does, I don't want to speak for Matt. We've struggled, I think, like a lot of legacy news organizations, about how to keep 2 feet on, one on print and one on digital. And like Matt, we have set up a separate, print team that does that separately. What I worry about is it's an apocryphal story about Netflix, where they had gone around to various news movie studios and said, "Hey, we're starting this streaming service, and we like your content." And and famously, certain executives said to Netflix, saying, "Oh, that's fine. Sounds like a great idea. We'll give you our content, but if this gets big, we're just going to move into that sector, and we're just going to crush you." And the response from the Netflix people was, "Yeah, maybe, but you're going to be doing a lot of other things, and this is the only thing we're doing." And I worry slightly that as a legacy news organization that has to keep tabs on both, someone in the digital sphere is going to figure this out and figure out a new model that could come after the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. So I always slightly run paranoid on this thing. I think we just have to pay attention, and if you watch our digital competitors, what they've done best at, if they've listened to the readers much more acutely than perhaps, and we were a little bit slow on this, I think, in more legacy media. We have come from a print legacy. Matt and I both came to the business when it was primarily a print product, where we kind of we put things in a paper and we send it out, and we're trying to telling you what we think is important. Part of the reason you're paying for this is our judgment. And then got news organizations come along and said, actually, we're going to hear what the readers want first, and we're going to give them what they want, which is actually how most businesses work. And so I think we have to be better at listening to the readers. You've seen things like newsletters and podcasts and these other innovations have been incredibly successful. We've started up, any number of what we call verticals, but they're based on a newsletter on a topic that readers talk about, and they take off, and we get sponsorship for them. We have to think more creatively how about newsrooms are structured. I still think that my news organization is too much structured around newspaper. When I started up as news editor in London 4 years ago, we were still organized in 4 desks, essentially. The foreign desk, the UK desk, the company's desk, and the markets desk. And that was because we had foreign pages, UK pages, markets papers, and companies pages. Well, why are we still organized based on a newspaper structure that doesn't exist anymore? If you look at the digital competitors, they're organized by topics. They have a China vertical, they have a Brexit vertical, they have a Trump vertical, and trying to organize your newsroom around that. Again, the China story is a great one that Matt raised. The China story is just not a China story. It is a China in the US story. It's a China in the Europe story. It's in China in finance. It's China in culture and Hollywood, and trying to harness those resources to be, again, in a structure that gets those people talking in not a traditional newspaper structure. That's hard. It's hard for an organization that has a lot of people like Matt and I who came in as print people and are a little bit wedded to it, but it has to be done. And I keep a very close eye on our digital competitors, because I think there's always that risk that they get it better than we do.
I'll quickly add, because I know we're running over. Look, I think technology itself changing is I can't predict. I'm not good at predicting, Chris, where we are in 5 years. But even as we race to update and adapt, the technology's ahead of us. So, in 5 years, maybe the number one way people get journalism from the Wall Street Journal will be voice. Voice is half of Google searches now are on voice. I think adapting more quickly to the change of technology is the job for while not losing the traits that made you what you are journalistically, is the task for any newsroom today, and it continues to evolve. So 5 years from now, I know it will be quite different. I'll add, the downside of technology is a real challenge too. So deep fakes, which are starting to burst into the mainstream, are going to really test news organizations soon and very seriously, and challenge our reporting. There's a role for us, because we could be the truth authenticators and verifiers in that kind of a world. But the continued evolution of technology itself is going to shape the future of the industry in 5 years. Voice, I think, is the big one, but there are other things I'm sure I don't see.
All right, we are out of time. I want to thank Peter Spiegel from the Financial Times and Matt Murray from the Wall Street Journal on joining us this week on the Quinnipiac University Speaker Series. Peter and Matt, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having us.
I really enjoyed it. I hope we didn't end your run of thoughtful conversation.
Oh, well, it was a good one while it lasted. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thank you.